for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Thank you. You may be seated. Let us pray. O Lord our God, now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts together be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our everlasting Redeemer. Amen. As most of you know, when writers write books, they usually have reasons for writing them. For example, sometimes writers just simply have a good story to tell, and they want to tell it. They want to share that story, and this is what lay behind a lot of really good novels that you sometimes read. Sometimes the intention of the author is to educate people, and this is what lay behind a lot of textbooks that you find, or books in the bookstore on dealing with marriage or raising children or dealing with stress and that sort of thing. Around this time of year, a lot of books show up telling you how to lose weight. And those books are usually intended to motivate people to do what they already know they should be doing. So writers usually have reasons for writing different sorts of books. Well, in our gospel lesson this morning, we read from the Gospel according to St. John, and the writer of this book has a reason for writing it as well. Near the end of his book, he tells you what that is. In John chapter 20, verse 31, John writes, "But these things are written so that you will believe Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing you will have life in his name." In other words, John wrote his gospel so that we might learn more about Jesus the Christ, and in doing so, that we might find hope in the midst of a skeptical age. Now, John's message is a message worth hearing today, isn't it? Most of you don't need me to tell you that we live, when it comes to the Christian faith, in a skeptical age, one that seems to be growing more and more skeptical with every passing decade. If we had the time this morning, I could walk you through all of the different polls that have been done and share all of the statistics that result from those polls. But suffice it to say that here in the United States, in the last couple of decades, overall church attendance has dropped by some 10%. The number of nuns, not N-U-N-S, who wear habits, but nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those who have no religious affiliation whatsoever, has risen by 7% in the last 7 years. And one of the most telling of the statistics has to do with the number of people who are outside the faith and how they view the Christian faith. At one point, I believe it was 1996, 85% of the people viewed it in a very positive way. These are people outside the faith. But now only 16% of the young people outside of the faith view Christianity in a favorable way. Well, in light of that, this morning, we're beginning the first in a series of sermons on the book of John. And we're beginning it under the general theme, Why Christ? Finding Hope in a Skeptical Age. If you've come here this morning and you are full of doubts and questions, I'm glad you're here. If you've come this morning and you're a bit skeptical of the faith or cynical about the Christian faith, I want you to know that I am glad you're here. I hope that you will bring all of your doubts, all of your questions, any skepticism you might have, and that over these next weeks we might engage in a kind of dialogue. Because over these next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the questions that people ask about the faith. And my hope, my prayer, is that as we ask these questions, as we try to delve into these questions, we're all going to find some answers that will fill our lives with hope. That the answers will lift us from where we are to where we can be. And that it will add some meaning and fulfillment to our lives. Now, this morning we want to begin right where the Gospel of John begins, with the question, why is Christ unique? When John wrote his gospel, you may recall that he wrote in the midst of a world that was filled with religious diversity and pluralism. In addition to Judaism, people worshiped Greek gods. Some people worshiped the various Roman gods. Some worshiped Egyptian gods. There was Baal worship, and there were other pagan forms of worship. Today, we too live in a world of religious diversity and pluralism, don't we? In preparation for this morning's sermon, I read somewhere that there are some 4,200 different religions in the world. Besides the 5 major ones of Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, there are such things as Confucianism, Taoism, the African diasporic religions, Mesoamerican religions, mysticism, New Age religions, and on the list could go. Even in his day, John knew that most religions have some things in common with one another. For example, most religions believe that there is at least one divine being that should be worshiped. Most religions believe that there is a spiritual part to people. Most religions have at least one or more prophets, and many of them have various sacred writings. Most religions try to answer ultimate questions like, why am I here, and what happens when I die? People want to know the answers to these sorts of questions, don't they? Parenthetically, the other night, I happened to be staying up late, so I watched the Stephen Colbert show, and I noticed that he was interviewing Jennifer Lawrence. And at one point during the interview, he asked her, he said, "What do you think happens when you die?" She replied, "I think they give your hospital bed to another patient." Well, that's probably not the answer he was expecting, and probably not the sort of answer that you would want to build your life upon. But John knew that there are some things that all people, all religions have in common with one another. At the same time, John was convinced that there are some things about Christ that separate him. Some things about Christ that make him unique and distinct. Things that can bring hope to a person's life. Things that can add meaning and fulfillment to a person's life. And he talks about some of those things in the first 14 verses of his book. What are some of those things? Well, one of the things that John says is unique and distinct about Christ is that he is the Logos. Notice what he says in the opening verses of his book. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Everything came into being through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came into being. Now, the word that John uses here for the word is the word logos. It is the word from which we get our words logic or logical. But in the ancient Greek, it meant far more than just logic. It had to do with the very mind and the very heart of God. It had to do with God's knowledge and God's wisdom and God's revelation. And John was saying that this logos, this word, was with God in the very beginning. That means that he was there at the beginning before anything that is was. If you travel out west and take in the spectacle of the Grand Canyon, scientists tell us that you are stepping back in time somewhere between 6 and 16 million years. If you happen to gaze up into the heavens on a dark, cloudless, clear night, scientists tell us that you are likely to spot some stars that are probably billions of years old. In fact, some scientists tell us that creation itself began about 15 billion years ago. But you know what John tells us? John tells us that before any of it, this word, this logo, this Christ was with God, and he was at the start of it. John takes it a step further, and by referring to Christ as the Logos, he was saying that Christ was the word that God used that actually brought everything into being. When God said, "Let there be light," the word, the Logos, the Christ that he used was Christ. When God said, "Let us make human beings in our image," the word, the Logos that he used was Christ. And John is saying that this is part of what makes Christ so unique, is that he is part of the very mind and the very heart and the very knowledge and wisdom and revelation of God. Beyond that, John tells us that part of what makes Christ unique is that he is the light that shines in the darkness. Once again, you don't need me to tell you that we live in a world full of darkness. We see it and hear it and experience it in all sorts of different ways, don't we? We see it through terrorism and natural disasters like tornadoes and floods that we've seen recently. We hear of people who commit unspeakable crimes towards other people. But often, in many cases, we find that people just bear their own personal or spiritual darkness quietly and under the radar. Sometimes when we look at people, we may think, that person has it all together. But when we do so, often we forget that below the surface of what we can see, people have struggles that we cannot see, struggles that leave these people filled with pain and with darkness. Natalie Cole. No sooner did we step through the threshold of a brand new year than we were told that the night before, Natalie Cole had died at the age of 65. Here was a woman who, at least on the surface, had everything going for her. A famous father, incredible talent, financial means, adoring fans. But for a long time, nobody knew that she was battling with demons that led her down a destructive path towards drug addiction. To her credit, with the help of family and friends and her faith, she fought her way back, but not before it had done incredible damage. John tells us that one of the things that makes Christ unique is that when we go through these times of darkness, he can be a light that shines in the midst of it, that he can lead us on a path out of that darkness into a life that is full of light. This is part of what we celebrate every year on Christmas Eve. Just a little over a week ago, we had about 4,500 people come through our Christmas Eve and Christmas Eve services. And we closed each one of these services the same way. We dimmed the lights. We took the candle from the Christ candle, lit it, and then we passed it among the entire congregation. And at each one of these services, I stood up in front and I watched as the light was spread and as the light began to grow, and as it grew, the darkness in the room was dispelled. That's what John is saying can happen in our lives and in the world when we allow the light of Christ to shine in the midst of the darkness. And then finally, John tells us that all of this is a gift that comes straight from the heart of a loving God. And that's too is part of what makes Christ unique and distinct. Notice again what he says in verse 14. The Word was made flesh and made his home among us. And excuse me, and then John goes on to say that this word that was made flesh was full of grace. That means that it was a gift, a gift. Something happens in our lives, doesn't it, when love takes a concrete form. On Christmas morning, my grandson, who is 4.5 years old, Max, gave me a gift. It was a very special gift. But before I tell you about it, there's a little bit of a backstory that you need to know. I've never been much of a cat guy. It's nothing personal. If you happen to have a cat, if you happen to love cats, I'm happy for you. I will still come to visit you in your home. It's nothing personal. It's just that a bunch of years ago, one day, a cat showed up at our doorstep and adopted our family for about 6 years. And for about 6 years, nobody could figure out why I was sick all the time. Turns out I happen to be allergic to cats. And so I've tried to keep my distance, a healthy distance, from cats over the years. But my grandson, Max, loves cats, adores cats. He doesn't have any, but he loves them. So this year on Christmas morning, when Max presented me his gift, my daughter said to me, "Now, Dad, Max loves you so much that he picked this gift out personally for you." Anybody want to guess what it was? It was not a cat, but it was a cat calendar, which means that every time I go to the refrigerator now for the next 12 months, I'm going to be looking at cats. But here's the thing. Because I know it came straight from the heart of my grandson, I'm thrilled with it. And here's what I'm trying to say to you this morning. When God took that logos, that word, and he wrapped it in human flesh, and he laid it in the humble surroundings of a manger stall, he gave you a gift, a very special gift, one you could never earn, one you could never deserve, one that comes straight from the heart of a loving God, one that can fill your life with light. And as Josh pointed out at the Christmas Eve service, when you get a gift like that, there's only one of two ways you can respond to it. You can either receive it or reject it. So, why Christ? Because, dear friends, he is the best shot at a life full of light that you are ever going to get in this lifetime. And that, dear friends, is the good news for this morning.